The island of Gyaros was a rock in the Aegean, treeless and waterless, where Nero sent men he wished to forget. When Musonius Rufus arrived there in the year 65, exiled for the second time in his life, he did not weep at the shore or curse the emperor who had sent him. He walked inland with the other condemned men and began, within days, to dig. By the end of that first season, travelers were sailing to Gyaros, not to pity the exiles, but to drink from the spring Musonius had found. You have perhaps imagined the philosopher as a man of pale hands and inward eyes, a figure bent over scrolls in a quiet room, whose body is merely the vessel that carries his mind from one argument to the next. This image is old, and it is wrong, and Musonius Rufus, the Roman knight who became one of the most respected teachers of the first century, spent his life arguing against it. He taught that the body is not the philosopher's inconvenience. The body is the philosopher's instrument, and what one does with the body day by day shapes what one becomes. The principle we will sit with in this lesson is one that Musonius pressed harder than any Stoic before him, and one that the tradition in the centuries that followed allowed to fade. He called it the training of the body as a form of moral training, not exercise for health, not discipline for appearance. Training, ascesis, undertaken so that the soul might learn through the flesh what it could not learn through argument alone. The fragments of Musonius that survive come down to us through the notes of his student Lucius, preserved in later anthologies. They are not polished essays. They are the substance of what he said in his classroom in Rome, and later in his exile, and later still when he returned. In the lecture we now call the 6th, on training, he puts the matter as directly as a teacher can. Since man, he says, is not soul alone nor body alone, but a kind of synthesis of the two. The man who is in training must attend to both. The body must be accustomed to cold, to heat, to thirst, to hunger, to plain food, to a hard bed, to abstinence from pleasure, to endurance under labor. And these habits, practiced upon the body, become, by a slow and faithful work, the habits of the soul. You will notice that this is not a stoicism of the mind only. It is not the cool intellectual exercise we sometimes imagine when we read Marcus, alone, by lamplight, or Epictetus speaking in his school. Musonius is older than Epictetus, who in fact studied under him, and he taught a stoicism that began in the muscles. He believed that a man who could not bear cold could not bear injustice. He believed that a man who needed soft bread could not refuse a tyrant's bribe. He believed, in short, that the discipline you practice in your body is the discipline you will have available to you when your soul is tested. And the discipline you do not practice will not appear by some miracle in the moment you require it. This is the principle: physical practice as moral practice. The body is the first school of the soul, and what we train it to endure, we train ourselves to endure. What we train it to refuse, we train ourselves to refuse. What we let it become accustomed to, we ourselves become. Let us reflect, before we go further, on who this man was, because the principle is inseparable from the life that produced it. Gaius Musonius Rufus was born in the Italian town of Volsini, probably around the year 30 in the Common Era, into a family of equestrian rank. This meant wealth, education, the prospect of public office, the comforts of the Roman upper class. He chose, as Seneca chose before him, and as so few of the Roman gentry chose, the life of philosophy rather than the life of the magistracies. By his middle years, he was teaching in Rome, and his school was attended by sons of senators, by young men of ambition, and by at least one freed slave from Phrygia named Epictetus, who would later carry Musonius's voice across the empire. He taught in Greek, though he was Roman. He taught women as well as men, which was unusual, and he wrote that women should be educated in philosophy because their virtue is the same virtue as men's, and the training of virtue must therefore be the same. He taught that marriage was the proper state of the philosopher, against the older view that the philosopher should remain unattached. He taught that one should not eat meat because the eating of flesh dulled the mind and accustomed the body to luxury. He taught in everything that philosophy is not what you say in the lecture hall. Philosophy is what you do when you rise in the morning, and what you eat at noon, and what you sleep upon at night. He was exiled 3 times. The first exile came under Nero in the conspiracy of Piso in the year 65, when Musonius's friendship with the philosopher and senator Rubellius Plautus made him suspect. He was sent to Gyaros, that barren island in the Cyclades, which Tacitus describes as a place fit only to punish men by its emptiness. Musonius lived there with other exiles. He taught philosophy on the rocks. He found, according to the historian Philostratus, a spring of fresh water that the islanders had not known existed, and pilgrims came from Athens and from the Asian coast to study with him because the soil of his teaching, even on Gyaros, was richer than the soil of Rome. He returned to Rome under Galba after Nero's death. He was exiled again under Vespasian, who expelled the philosophers from the city in the year 71, though Musonius alone, by some account, was permitted to remain or was recalled quickly because Vespasian respected him. The details are uncertain. The pattern is clear. He spent a significant portion of his teaching life in places he had not chosen, on rations he had not selected, under skies that were not the skies of his home, and his philosophy was built, stone by stone, out of these conditions. In the year 69, in the chaos that followed Nero's fall, when the armies of Vitellius marched on Rome and the city stood on the edge of civil war, Musonius went out among the soldiers. He walked, alone, into the ranks of the advancing legion. He spoke to them of peace. He spoke to them of the evils of war and the goods of concord. Tacitus, who tells this story in the 3rd book of his Histories, says that the soldiers laughed at him, and some threatened him, and he barely escaped with his life. But he went. He believed that a philosopher who would not place his body between violence and peace was not a philosopher at all. He had trained his body all his life to be available for such a moment, and when the moment came, the body was ready. You must understand that this readiness was not improvised. It was the product of decades of small refusals and small endurances, performed every day until they were no longer effortful but natural. This is the heart of what Musonius taught about training, and to see it clearly, we must look at how the principle functioned in detail in his own daily life and in the lives he shaped. Consider first his teaching on food. Musonius wrote a short lecture, which we now call the 18th, on food, and it is one of the most concrete pieces of Stoic writing that has survived. He says that the question of what we eat and how much we eat is not a small matter. It is, in fact, the first and most constant test of self-control, because we face it 3 times a day, every day, for our entire lives. The man who cannot rule his appetite for food, he says, will not rule his appetite for anything. He recommended a diet of bread, fruits, raw vegetables, cheese, milk. He thought cooked food, and especially the elaborate cooking of the Roman tables of his time, encouraged a man to eat for pleasure rather than for nourishment, and to eat more than his body required, and to crave variety and rarity and expense. He thought meat, in particular, was unsuitable, both because it was heavy on the stomach and because, as he put it, it belongs more to wild beasts than to men. Whether or not we follow him in this, we should see what he is doing. He is taking an ordinary, daily, inescapable act, the act of eating, and making it the practice ground for the soul. If you can sit down to plain bread when the table next to you is laden with delicacies, he taught, you have practiced, in a small way, the indifference to externals that the Stoics call the central work of life. If you can rise from the table while you are still slightly hungry, you have practiced, in a small way, the refusal of excess. And if you do this not once, but every day, for years, you will find, when a tyrant offers you wealth in exchange for silence, that the refusal is already in your hands. You have rehearsed it 3 times a day, your whole life. Consider next his teaching on clothing and shelter. Musonius wore the simple Greek cloak, the tribon, the same garment that Socrates had worn and that the Cynics wore after him. He went barefoot when possible. He slept on a hard bed or on the ground. He bathed in cold water rather than in the heated baths that were the daily pleasure of Roman citizens of his class. When his students asked him why, he answered, according to the fragments, that the body which is accustomed to soft beds and warm baths becomes, after a time, unable to do without them, and the man who cannot do without them is the slave of whoever provides them. This is the political dimension of his physical training, and it must not be missed. Musonius taught under emperors. He saw what the wealth of Nero's court did to the senators who frequented it. He saw men of philosophical training, men who knew the arguments of Zeno and Chrysippus by heart, fall silent in the face of tyranny, because the loss of their villas and their dinners and their slaves was unbearable to them. They had not trained their bodies to do without these things, and so their souls, when the test came, could not do without them either. The body had captured the soul. When Musonius was sent to Gyaros, he did not suffer the exile as a Roman senator would have suffered it. He had been preparing for it, in a sense, every day of his life. The hard bed of Gyaros was not very different from the hard bed of his Roman house. The plain food of Gyaros was not very different from the plain food he had always eaten. The cold of Gyaros was a cold he had practiced standing in. And so the exile, which would have broken another man, was only an extension of the life he had already chosen. He could teach on the rocks because the rocks were not foreign to him. He had made himself, by long training, at home wherever he found himself. There is a story preserved by Aulus Gellius in the Attic Nights that I want you to hear because it shows the principle in its most ordinary application. A young man came to Musonius one day, complaining that the philosophy he was being taught was too hard. The lectures were demanding. The reasoning was strict. The young man wanted some softer instruction. Musonius listened, and then he said, more or less, that medicine which causes no pain is no medicine, and the philosophy that does not strain you is not philosophy. He said it without cruelty. He said it as a doctor says it. The work is supposed to be hard. The hardness is the work. And consider finally what he did with his body in the moment of greatest stakes, when he walked into the lines of the Vitellian troops in the year 69. He was an old man by then, in his late 30s or early 40s by some counts, older by others. He went unarmed. He went without escort. He spoke to soldiers who had marched for months, who were hungry, who were drunk on the prospect of sacking Rome. And he spoke, Tacitus tells us, of peace. The soldiers might have killed him. They were within an hour of crossing into the city to begin the slaughter. They did not kill him, but only because some among them recognized him and pulled him away before the others could strike. What allowed him to walk there? It was not courage, as we ordinarily speak of courage, a sudden welling of resolve. It was the long, patient, daily training of the body and the soul to be willing. He had practiced in countless small ways the refusal to flinch. He had practiced cold and hunger and the loss of his city and the indifference to comfort. When the moment came to place his unarmed body between the legions and the capital, the body went. It went because it had been trained every day to go where the soul directed. This is what Musonius means when he says that the philosopher must train. The training is not for the gymnasium. The training is not for health, though health may follow. The training is for the day, which comes to every life, when the soul will require something of the body that no untrained body can give. Let us now state plainly what Musonius is teaching, because it is easy to hear all of this and to convert it, almost without noticing, into something more comfortable than what he actually said. He is not saying that physical hardship is good in itself. He is not a flagellant. He does not believe, as some later traditions came to believe, that the body is an enemy to be punished. The body is, in his teaching, the partner of the soul, the synthesis without which the human being does not exist. To despise the body is as foolish, in his view, as to indulge it. He is also not saying that you must adopt his particular practices. He happened to wear a Greek cloak and to eat raw vegetables and to bathe in cold water. These were the forms his training took, in his time and in his place. The principle beneath the forms is what he is teaching, and the principle is this: whatever conditions you accustom your body to, those are the conditions under which your soul will be free. Whatever conditions you cannot bear in your body, those are the conditions under which your soul will be a slave. The wise man knows that comfort is not neutral. Every comfort to which you become habituated is a comfort whose absence will, in the future, disturb you. Every pleasure you take regularly is a pleasure whose loss will, when it comes, be experienced as a wound. This is not a moral judgment on comfort or pleasure. It is an observation about how the human creature is constituted. We are formed by what we repeat. We become, over time, what we have grown used to. And so the question is not whether to allow the body to be shaped, but what to shape it toward. Musonius is asking you to consider what your body is currently being trained to need. Consider the temperature you require for sleep. Consider the food you assume will be available. Consider the chair you sit in, the bed you sleep on, the clothes you reach for in the morning. None of these are wrong. None of these are vices. But each of them is a habit, and each habit has, attached to it, a quiet condition. Without this, I am uncomfortable. Without this, I cannot work. Without this, I am not myself. The Stoic question, sharpened by Musonius, is whether you would still be yourself without these conditions, whether the self you have built can stand on different ground, whether, if circumstances should remove the comforts you now require, there would be a person left who could go on and teach and walk into the legions if the legions came. He is teaching, in other words, that freedom is a physical practice. We sometimes speak of freedom as if it were a matter of belief, of inner disposition, of mental framing. The Stoics did say something like this, and Epictetus said it more famously than anyone. But Musonius, the teacher of Epictetus, taught that the inner freedom must be rehearsed in the outer life, or it does not exist. You cannot decide in the moment of trial to be free. You can only discover in the moment of trial whether the years behind you have made you free. It is thus that he insists again and again in the fragments that training is more important than learning. He says in the lecture on training that of those who study philosophy, some learn the arguments and some do the work, and the ones who do the work are the philosophers, even if they cannot recite a single proposition. The ones who only learn the arguments are not philosophers. They are people who can talk about philosophy. The distinction is sharp, and it is meant to be sharp, because the whole point of his teaching is that philosophy without training is nothing. It is words. It is air. And so, when we read Musonius, we are not being asked to memorize a doctrine. We are being asked to begin a practice. The practice does not have to be grand. He himself recommended beginning with small things. Skip a meal you would have eaten. Sleep without the extra blanket. Walk a distance you would have ridden. Refuse a pleasure that was on offer, not because the pleasure is bad, but to discover whether you can. And do it again tomorrow. And do it again the day after that. And in a year, you will be a different creature. And in 10 years, you will be the kind of person who could walk into the legions, because you will have practiced in 10,000 small ways the willingness to go. This is the structural lesson. The body is the soul's apprentice, and the soul is the body's teacher, and the apprenticeship is daily, and there is no graduation. Musonius did not stop training when he became a famous teacher. He did not stop training in his exile. He did not stop training when he was old. The work is the work for as long as the life is the life. We are nearly at the end of this lesson, and I want to leave you, as Musonius would have left a student, with something to carry. He believed, and the fragments make this very clear, that most of human suffering is not the suffering imposed by the world, but the suffering produced by our own untrained responses to the world. The cold itself does not torment the man who has stood in cold before. The hunger itself does not break the man who has been hungry by choice. The exile itself does not crush the man who has lived all his life as though he might be exiled tomorrow. The world has not changed in any of these cases. The man has changed, and the change was made slowly by the body in the years before the trial. So the question I would set before you, in the manner of the old teacher who taught on the rocks of Gyaros, is this: what is your body currently rehearsing? Not what does it do once, on the day you feel strong, but what does it do every day, without your noticing, by long and quiet habit? What comforts has it come to require? What absences has it forgotten how to bear? And if tomorrow the world removed the things your body now assumes, who would be standing there in the place where you used to be? You need not answer this question quickly. Musonius would not have expected a quick answer. He would have expected you to walk with the question, perhaps for a long time, and to let it shape, in some small way, the next meal you eat, the next bed you sleep in, the next pleasure you accept or decline. He would have expected the answer to come not in thought, but in practice, and not all at once, but slowly, the way a spring is dug from dry ground, one stroke at a time, until the water rises. He died, we believe, sometime in the reign of Vespasian, or shortly after, an old man who had outlived 3 emperors and 3 exiles, and who left behind no books of his own, only the notes of his students, only the memory of the way he had lived. Epictetus, when he became a teacher himself, quoted him often. He called him simply Rufus, as a son calls a father. And the philosophy that Epictetus taught, the philosophy that reached Marcus Aurelius, and through him reached us, carried inside it, like a stone in its foundation, the teaching of the old man who had said that the body is the first school of the soul, and that what we do not train, we cannot become. It is enough, I think, to end here.